and welcome to the November 2024 edition of Cincinnati JavaScript. We're joined by Alex Nahas of Soundtrace, and today Alex will be talking about local first with VitePWA and Dexiejs. Take it away, Alex.
I really enjoy, playing with different browser APIs and, making good software. And recently there's been a bunch of tools, local first, right? That's probably people have been in development for a long time. We're like, wow, it's like old development style, right? Where your application lives on your computer. Like, what is this? This is not a new thing, right? But to web development, it kind of is, right? We've kind of seen a migration to the cloud over the past, I don't know, decade or so, moving everything to AWS and so on. And yeah, this is kind of a new paradigm. There's some new things have been added to the browser, particularly that have made it kind of realistic to have this be a way to write software, particularly websites that work offline. So let me share my presentation here. Let me just make sure it's all good to go. All right, local first software. So, like I said, it's been around for a while, but what really got people excited again was there's this research lab called Ink and Switch, and they put out this paper called well, we can look at it right now. It's called Local First Software, and it's basically talking about how everything's in the cloud right now, how it's very brittle, it's very expensive. Like if you have your data with a startup, there's nothing to say that once that startup goes under, all that data that you've stored with them, maybe they'll give you a short window where you can egress it, but it's gone, right? You have it's a massive headache, and it's a dangerous thing to do. So it's kind of a movement or a suggestion of ways to bring the ownership of data and applications back to the user, so work and live on device. Um, so yeah, and they laid out some premises. First of all, it has to be fast, like no loading spinners. It has to be multi-device access, and that's not what we'll have today. It's kind of it's a it's a scale, right? Or it's a gradient on how local first your application is, depending on these criteria. But multi-device access, think of something like Figma have used it where you can have multiple people collaborating on the same thing. Offline functionality, it's kind of the local first, offline first. It needs to have first class support for offline functionality. So the app needs to be able to work, or core features of the app need to be able to work offline. Seamless collaboration, long-term data preservation, and privacy by default. So a lot of the things we'll see in local first too is that just having your device is a good enough authentication method a lot of the time. So that's something that we can look more into as well. Any questions so far before we get into it? I just want to make sure everyone kind of understands what this means, and before I get too deep into everything.
I'm just thinking through it. Like a lot of times, what I see when I see local first is like essentially database replication to the browser in some way, and there's like
Mhm.
syncing problems and stuff with that.
Yep.
This sounds a little bit different, so I guess it's not a question. I'm just curious where this leads.
No, no, that's actually correct. Yeah. So I'd say and we'll get into it here, but there's really three parts of a local first application. There's the persistence layer, which is a client side database of some kind. Traditionally if you're having an SPA, like a single page web application, you're probably storing a lot of your data in memory on the browser, right? Or on for that local web page. So um, all of that data from your REST API or Sync API or WebSocket or whatever is all being loaded into maybe React State or Redux or whatever you may be using, and then you're using that as kind of a queryable client-side database. But that, unfortunately, as soon as you turn off your internet connection and you refresh the page, all of that's gone, right? But there are different persistence layers we'll talk about. IndexedDB, local storage are the two ones that are built into the browser, but there's some really cool stuff going on with WebAssembly, and we can where you can actually run databases like SQLite and Postgres directly inside of the browser. But based on the built-in tools, the three really cool APIs that have they've been around for a while, but they're kind of becoming more fleshed out, and that is the service worker. So if you're familiar with the web workers, they're kind of like off-screen windows that you can run JavaScript on. And the service worker is a special kind of web worker that acts as like a proxy server between your like application or like your window, your website, and whatever network. So it intercepts fetch requests. It can intercept all sorts of requests, and it can act as like a proxy to just cache to feed from cache directly. Um, and VitePWA, which is the technology we're looking at, if you're using Vite as a build tool for your client side application, there's like a zero configuration way just to set that up. You just drop all your assets into a folder, whether they be, JavaScript, HTML, and maybe you have like a favicon or some images. And it will, as soon as you're offline, it'll just redirect to the service worker and pull from those directly. Really interesting stuff. And I'd recommend if you are building an SPA, especially a React SPA that ships a massive amount of JavaScript to the browser, that you implement this tool. It'll make your life and your users' lives a lot better. Um, but yeah, progressive web apps, that's kind of the browsers. I'd say if you haven't heard of them, the browser's trying to close the gap between like a native app experience and a website. So you can download um, a website essentially as that application. You can have an icon on your screen that kind of looks like a native application, whether that be like a desktop application or a mobile application, and they open up to a full screen app that looks like an application, but it's actually a website. They're they're kind of contentious right now. All the browsers are really into them except for Apple, who see them as like an existential threat to their um, app store, and of course they basically kill any sort of support for it, and are constantly battling them. Hopefully that gets better. I think there's been some regulations in the EU that have kind of pushed them to like support PWAs better, but at Soundtrace, the company I work for, we use a PWA, and it's and along with some other browser APIs that Apple doesn't support, and it's a massive pain. So okay, let's go on to the next one. So we just talked about it, but yeah, there's the first part of the local first application is probably the most important part. That's client side data persistence, and what's really been cool here is that there's been some better tools built in this space. For a while, there was something called WebSQL, which was a browser API that got deprecated in favor of IndexedDB. And if you've ever worked with IndexedDB, it's a pretty terrible API. It's in-browser database. It's kind of like a key value store database, but it's queryable, and it has it has a query language similar to SQL, more similar to like MongoDB if you've ever used that. But it's not the greatest API, but it's what we have. We have local storage as well, but it's local storage is capped to like, I don't know, a few megabytes, and it's not really realistic for a production application to host a entire database in local storage. And it's also a synchronous API, a local storage, so it makes it difficult to use without really slowing down your website. IndexedDB is promise based or callback based. There's promise based wrappers around it, but it's what we use at Soundtrace for our local first approach, and there are tools that make it much better, which is Dexiejs, which we'll talk about more. But in terms of cool, new, interesting, high tech stuff, we have PG Lite, which is Postgres inside of the browser. It's a WebAssembly build of it, and you load it in to your browser via the private file system API. You chunk it up or IndexedDB, and you can use it just like you would any other Postgres database. You can use it with ORMs like Drizzle or whatever you might be using, and it's really, really, really nice to work with. It's about 3 MB, but if you're already shipping, 10 megabytes of React JavaScript code, it's not that much more. And like I said, everything is going to be cached by the service worker if you're doing it right. So you're really optimizing for your second load, not your first load here. SQLite, that's, if you've ever done mobile development or local development on like a desktop app, that's kind of like it's the world's most prolific database. It's really nice. There's like a lot of products recently that have come out that are SQLite based, like databases as a service, but it's they have a WebAssembly build for it as well. It's been around for a while, but they've come up with faster ways to do it, to use it in browser, and it's both that and PG Lite have much nicer, just pure SQL ways of interacting with your data as opposed to like a strange IndexedDB query language. So we have our local in-browser database, right? We have pretty much instant reads and writes to that database. We're saying, okay, because we're not dealing with the network layer, we can just write directly and get, like I said, basically instant reads and writes. The issue with that is that now we are having this source of truth on our own browser, but it doesn't necessarily represent what other people see. And that's kind of been the issue with local first, the web for a long time. There's been a lot of different solutions to this. A lot of people have gone pure server side. Like I think a really good example of something that worked really well in that space is like Elixir's Phoenix framework. It's pretty much it's WebSocket based. It's based on Postgres, and I know a lot of people here know a lot about it. But it does a really great job of fixing this sync like a client synchronization issue by just only like delegating everything to the server. And but like I said, it's for like a local thing. We don't really have a great way around that. But that's where these tools that have come out recently have done a good job of solving that problem. So the first one is like the first data fetching paradigm here is if your standard REST request response paradigm. It's really common in web development. You send a request for whatever you want to your database or to your server. It sends a response with that request. And so every time you visit a website, you're essentially getting the same data, right? And you're sending that same request and it's responding with that same data or slightly different variations of that data. Or you're sending posts or patches to that database, and you're still getting like there's like a lot of wasted stuff there. Like for example, if you have a very read heavy application where your data is pretty stagnant, you're basically sending the same data over the socket every single time you look at your app. And that's kind of what like local first aims to fix as well, is that you're sending diffs as opposed to your entire database or like whatever section of that database that your user has access to. So that's where this the sync engine comes in. So you have in the local data local first paradigm, you have your components, which is like your client side databases. Maybe you have a mobile app and then you have a browser application, and you want those two client databases to be in sync with each other. So if one person edits one document, you want that change to be represented on user two's UI as well. So you write to your local store, whether that be like IndexedDB or whatever. The sync engine picks that up, and then that will send that to the database. Usually some sort of pub sub is on that side. It'll send that back down to your sync engine, and that will disseminate all of those changes to all of your clients. And everyone will have that in real time. Instead of sending big diffs, you're just sending these things called CRDTs, content-free replicated data types, which is a special type of document, like a data document type that two people can basically add it at the same time. Like if two people are editing the same document, I'm trying to think how to explain this. If person A edits the document, and person B edits the document as well, the CRDT is a data type that will resolve that conflict. Let's say if the person deletes the document, the other person edits it, it'll go through and make sure that that document is properly like time-based, properly edited on like a proper time scale. And that's what's like been the big thing that's made this possible recently. So as trying to get too technical here, but that's kind of the dream of local first is having this sync layer and this because these CRDTs can be essentially used or like can be hosted and processed by any sort of sync server. The idea is like that this local first landscape will look like a bunch of clients and then like framework agnostic sync services. It'll just be a protocol, and that anyone can just have their clients synced to other clients based on this protocol with any database. And like these, it doesn't necessarily need to be one service. It'll just be kind of like the web is, a protocol that everyone agrees on, and then you can set up your own server and then have that be part of the web without actually having to build your own version of the web to participate in it. It's kind of a long goal, but this is Martin Kleppmann here on the left, and he's the guy that wrote that paper for Make and Switch, and he's been the one that's really been doing a lot of innovations in the space. If you want to check out Ink and Switch, they have a lot of good papers on like the different things that are in local first and the different problems they're aiming to solve. So yeah, real world examples. We can take a look real quick. But I think if you're familiar with the most popular one is probably like a agile app called Linear. And if you've ever used it, it's really nice. It's local first, so it has everything. It has a sync layer. It has everything. This is just like a small thing I just made for this, but You can turn off, for example, your network and it still works, right? You can go to anything, you can check out the different stuff. There's a problem with syncing the data here, but we can reload it. And like your UI still functions essentially, and it'll tell you you're offline. But when you go back online, it'll give you a little syncing flag here, looking for changes. It'll sync all those locally. It'll resolve whatever local rights you have with whatever rights have been done by other people. It'll sync those all up. It's really cool. I highly recommend checking out the app if you are interested in getting inspired to write some local first software. I think this is kind of the gold standard in the industry right now for somebody that's done it right. But beyond that, there's like Google Docs, Figma. Those are both really, really good local first apps as well. Okay, so what else do we got here? If you want to learn more about resources, we can click through some different options for things right now. Also, this little AI generated picture. I was messing around with generating things for this presentation, and this is what it came up with. It's like nonsense, but it's kind of hilarious. Anyway, so I left it in. So here's like this is the local first web.dev. This is if you're looking for resources to learn more, and I'll post it in the chat here to learn more about like creating software in the space. I would recommend checking this out. It has oh wait, I just sent that to one person. It has resources for basically everything you would want inside of if you were on to build this kind of software. So, for example, I know a lot of people are big into Elixir here, and there is a really cool sync service, I think probably one of the most promising ones called Electric SQL. And it's a sync service that's based on Elixir. If you're not familiar with Elixir, is based on Erlang and the Beam VM. And it's like basically this Erlang is this language that solved a bunch of these concurrency and like, distributed like server and data problems like years ago. And Elixir is like a wrapper on top of that, like a language wrapper on top of that, that does a really, really great job of doing like this kind of distributed software stuff. And so they've written a sync engine on top of that that does a really good job. And it's Postgres only, but it also has client SDKs if you want to, um, you know, uh, work with any sort of local store, and you can set your own conflict resolution logic and things like that. But they're actually the ones that have done PG Vector. But yeah, they're really good, really good. I highly recommend checking them out. They've actually just rewritten their entire application. So they realized their initial sync service didn't scale. It was based on WebSockets, and WebSockets are stateful. So they have a difficult time scaling sometimes for something like this, which is like a synchronization service where you might be syncing an entire database. So they've done it on like a expanded version of HTTP. And yeah, so this one's really interesting to look out for. I'd say that's probably my pick in the space. But let's say if you're something like a React developer, they have full stack solutions that like work right out of the box for whatever you want to do. The one we'll look at today is Dexiejs, which is probably your easiest, most browser true to your browser API framework. It's just a wrapper around an XDB that gives you some nice hooks for different frameworks that you can have observable queries with. Yeah, but highly recommend checking these out. In fact, Electric SQL actually has a client for Phoenix as well. So those of you who want to deal with like synchronization between clients, that could be interesting for that sort of application as well. Yeah, so the two ones here, VitePWA. If you don't know, Vite is a build tool for the web. It's kind of taken over client-side JavaScript space for building applications. It's based on ES modules, whereas its predecessor Webpack was not, and it's much less complicated. It does a really good job, and I can even show you scaffold the project how easy that is. But it's a zero configuration PWA. It sets up Workbox for you in the background, which is Google's library for working with service workers. Service workers are another thing, kind of like IndexedDB, that have a clunky API, but they have good extractions built by other people on top of them. So I recommend using those, not rolling your own. If you want to see what an application looks like, let me pull up here. This is something am I sharing my screen here? There we go. This is something that I've been working on in the background. This is a new, Tim and I were talking about it when this first started. It's a new browser API called the prompt API. So this entirely works in your browser. If we turn off, and if you guys want to visit it, it requires a special version of Chrome and amongst other things, but it'll leave instructions for how to get it all downloaded. Um, and it works completely offline. So let me show you here. Let's go ahead and let's turn off the internet access for this website. And if we look at the network tab and refresh the page, the only thing that didn't get loaded in is the favicon because I didn't cache it, or I didn't even have one. But everything else gets instantly loaded in. And let me try to figure out where to put this little zoom screen. Sorry. It gets instantly loaded in, and it says like the size of service worker, right? It's the service worker is reaching out for these files, the JavaScript, the HTML, etc. And it's just being served directly by the service worker. The service worker realizes it's offline, and it just serves the latest version of the application. And so if you refresh, you get instant writes. And because everything is in IndexedDB, you refresh again, we still have those new things we made. So we could go test, and this is all in device. It's pretty cool, but this is like an LLM that lives entirely in the browser. And yeah, this is all happening directly in browser. So there we go. I know that was probably pretty quick. We can build out a little demo app too if you guys want to do that. I didn't have too much prepared today, but yeah, I was kind of hoping this would be more of a Q&A style session. So if anyone has questions or wants to go into more detail on any of this stuff, yeah, let me know.
Alex, I got a quick one.
Yeah, sure. What's up, Bill?
The so does the remote and local database have to be homogeneous? Like if you use if you use Postgres in locally, yeah, I guess maybe it would at least simplify things, or maybe not. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's like Postgres to Postgres, I think is probably the easiest way to sync. I think because that's you like with the database, you have this thing called like the oplog, which is just like a series of, writes to the database that you can play back on another database and seed it that way. So I think that's how Electric SQL does it um, for Postgres, but they have different algorithms for different like database to database stuff. So yeah, you can sync Postgres to basically anything. You just need to have somebody write you that like translation layer between the one database to another.
Interesting. Cool.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty cool. There's I think Postgres, like basically all of these tools, these local first tools, are all based on Postgres because Postgres has this concept of like a shape data type, which is what they use to do syncing. It's kind of like their version of the CRDT. So it's like a lot of it's built on this data type. I think more databases are getting supported. For example, like if you're familiar with like the MongoDB space, MongoDB Realm just got deprecated, and that was MongoDB's like kind of mobile, local, not local first, but like local compatible sync service between MongoDB and local devices, and they just deprecated that. And so I think another one of these players in the space called PowerSync is trying to write a MongoDB to SQLite or like mobile database sync engine. So yeah, a lot of stuff happening in the space. Any more questions?
Yeah, so I was wondering like if so say there's somebody that does some editing offline and then somebody online does just deletes like that whole section.
Mm-hmm.
Um does that mean that basically what it does is just it reflects the latest changes that happen, or how does it handle that those
Yeah,
changes?
that's a great question. That's kind of like the big thing that everyone's trying to solve. And that's what CRDTs, that data type I was talking about earlier. That's kind of like the data type that is like will work for that sort of thing. So you can write rules based on your CRDT framework that'll tell you how they resolve different situations like that. So you could say like, hey, for the CRDT tool, I could either have it resolved so it'll be like the person that edited the document after somebody deleted it, because they edited it, that the document gets recreated. Or you could say, hey, that document was deleted, but when that person edited it, so it's deleted and that edit doesn't go anywhere. And you can either have you can delegate that out to a provider, like some of these full stack local first frameworks do, and they'll tell you like kind of the rules of the game and how you should follow it. Or you can write your own with YJS or some
Mhm.
other thing like it.
And does it have like so like if you is this just like in JavaScript or is there other languages that you have you can use something like this with? Like is it written in other languages or is it just JavaScript?
Yeah, so a bunch of other languages. I think auto merge is another one, another CRDT implementation, and that's built in Rust. I think there are Python ones, but I think auto merge is probably the one that is most famous outside of YJS. But yeah, I think there is a Python implementation of it from the auto merge team as well.
Okay. So does it easily integrate with different languages like when you bring different like if you create your I'm assuming like wait, does this overtake APIs? Like you don't no longer need to have an API when
Yeah,
you
yeah, exactly. So
oh
uh, it's kind of used to be I'd say the ideal like kind of how we use it as sound trace, and I could show some of our app, the company I work for. But it's used to be meant to be kind of a addition to your REST API. So let's say like you have there are certain things that REST APIs are really good for, right? They're stateless. So like if you have data that doesn't get read very often, but it's like a lot of data. Like let's say you're reading, like for us, we have decimeters, like sound meters, essentially that listen to sound events and then they get seeded in the database. And we have millions of documents of these, right? And so if somebody wants to say like, what are the sound levels from X to Y? That's maybe, 300 megabytes or whatever, 30 megabytes of just sound level data. That doesn't really make sense to send diffs on. It's
mhm.
probably a better tool for like a REST API. But let's say if you have like a location, like, hey, like I have user data or whatever, and it's always the same every single time you visit your application, and it's or it doesn't get changed very often, or if it does, you want those changes to be represented, like updated on everyone's computer pretty much instantly. That's where
Mhm.
like a sync service and a CRDT and a local client database come in like really, really well.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Alex, it's not really a question, but I think it's really interesting. Like the very first really big conference that I got to go to as a developer was the Microsoft Mobile Dev Con conference in like 2005 in Vegas. Like it was just overwhelming because it was the first time I've ever been to Vegas. And the big topic of conversation there was the Windows Mobile 5 phones, but everybody had like restricted data plans at the time. And so like the big thing that all the conference talks and everything were about were how to do syncing, right? So they had like Lite, SQL Server Lite or something for Windows CE and Windows 5, Mobile 5. And like the whole point of it was like you stick your like mobile phone into the dock at night and it would sync the latest version of the database and basically do all the conflict resolution and stuff, and it would pop up like their UI to like sync between SQL Server and SQL Server Lite or whatever it was called.
Cool. Yeah.
And it just makes me laugh a little bit because it feels like this is almost revisiting the time when mobile data plans were not ubiquitous, like unrestricted essentially. But I think that the same principles still apply, right? Like if you could just get rid of all of the APIs, if you get rid of all the pieces of complexity in the applications and just pretend again like you're building like a desktop application where everything
Hmm.
is local to the machine that you're on, then you get to kind of abstract away a lot of really hard problems and just kind of
Yeah.
pretend for a little while that they don't exist. But CRDTs kind of give you the ability to not even have to make that trade-off, right? So like I
Yeah.
think you're still limited by the cap theorem, right? But like there's well-known ways of like dealing with dealing with those conflicts when they come up. It's really wild to hear what you're saying, just to relate it to something way early in my career.
Yeah, it's if one thing that's been really nice, especially with working with like if you're a React developer, like you have to, if you're dealing with REST APIs, which I feel like a lot of us are, we have to deal with loading states, error states, mutation states where you've made the local mutation in memory, but the database hasn't confirmed that, your request is successful yet. So you have to kind of say like, oh, it's, maybe you do optimistic updates and there's like, 4 or 5 states you have to take care of in your reactive UI if you're trying to like, really go above and beyond. But the nice thing about just getting instant reads and writes is that you just, first of all, you don't have to worry about overfetching or underfetching or things like that. You could just request the data directly that you want from your local database and then write to it instantly. And all of those like states, and like worrying about, especially with React, like re-renders and things like that, like all of that goes out the window. It's a really, really fantastic developer experience. Yeah, so highly recommend checking that out. In fact, I know I talked about Dexiejs, but um, that's they have this concept of a use live query. So if you're familiar with the React, like you'll have a use state, and then like you'll call a REST API, and you'll have a setter function that'll, a use effect will call that REST API. Then you have a setter function, and that use effect that sets the state, and then your UI will react with that state. Maybe you'll have a loading and error state as well. But for this, you just declare a variable, you set a live query to your IndexedDB database. So, and then your UI will just react from there. And they have Svelte, Vanilla, Vue, Angular, all the different frameworks, implementations for that. And building out, this fun thing, like that's an entire level of abstraction I just don't have to worry about anymore. I can still get that persistence without having to think about any of these loading states. And all of this, all of it's persistent. Like all of this data is all getting persisted. If I go back here, oops, well, not that time, but this time I got persisted. And yeah, it's a really nice way to do development.
And so is it just like for REST, if you're just gonna have like a RESTful API, or does it work well with like SOAP or and other architecture type
Uh,
APIs?
I don't really, I'm not really sure. I've never really messed with like kind of older. I haven't. I've done a bit of GraphQL. I've never done SOAP, but I've never done anything like I don't know, like gRPC or some of these more like different ones. But yeah,
Okay.
this kind of like sync service is not even something like you're not really even thinking about the network layer when you're doing it. You're just thinking about, hey, how do I write to my local database and how do I read from my local database? And you don't even have to think really about like Tim said, like all of that's kind of taken care of for you in the background, all those hard problems that you have to worry about.
Mm.
It kind of reminds me of I can't remember the name of the company that's doing it, but they're basically building in to Postgres like uh integrations with third-party APIs. So like I'm trying to think of a good example of it. Um, if you wanted to query like your company's HR software, normally they would give you an API and you'd call and you get JSON stuff back and you'd have to like integrate it that way if you wanted to do that. And what they're doing instead is just making it a query in Postgres. So you just query a table that's kind of virtual almost in Postgres, and it makes the API call essentially either ahead of time and syncs it, or it does it on the fly, and you end up with just a SQL interface into third-party information, which is kind of a novel thing. I hadn't heard of that before then, but if you kind of move that all the way down into the browser, that's I can see why that's a very compelling story for development, right? Like being able to just treat everything local and not have to worry too much about like async promises
Mm.
for everything that you do, and be able to like kind of have that resolution system in place separately. It's neat.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I wasn't really familiar with the space at all, but one of the first um, things I worked on when I joined Soundtrace was we do audiometric testing, which is hearing test essentially over a web app for different clients. And we had people that because our app it's a website, they wanted to give these tests to to people that like are on remote sites and essentially don't have internet connection in some of these. That's kind of opened my eyes to this entire space. Like I had heard of PWAs, I had heard of service workers and things like that, but I never really explored kind of using these tools because they are kind of like they do seem kind of like scary and but like VitePWA and Dexiejs, like they do a great job of abstracting the hard parts away for you, and you can pretty much just get the benefits. And yeah, so it's cool. Like you can have a website, your people visit what they want. They load in their client list or the employees they want to test, and then they take their hearing test, and then we wrote like a really simple sync service, which is just based on REST to say, hey, you have local things that are not synced with the database. Now that you're back online, sync those up and make sure they're all good, and then you can delete them once they're synced. And yeah, it's writing your own sync service. Our data is very read heavy at Soundtrace, and it's not really a lot of it's immutable. So we're kind of the perfect candidate for this, where we can do writes and without having to really worry about other people also making writes to those same documents. A lot of the times, employee information, location information, audiogram tests because they're medical tests. Like once they're done, like you're not editing those at all. So it's there definitely are applications that are better candidates for this sort of thing. Like if you have a really form heavy application, I think probably like a Phoenix Elixir would be a better idea, where like all of that data, like in source of truth, needs to live on the server anyway. You don't want to give the client too much data or too much information. But yeah, it's a pretty cool way of building certain applications. Any other questions?
Something else that's a local first or local capable, I guess, application that might have a lot of bearing for most of the people here. If you haven't heard of it, there's a tool called devdocs.io. It uses the same doc sets, I think, that Dash does, if you're familiar with using Dash for API stuff. But yeah, devdocs.io is wild because you
Cool.
can, yeah, it basically is just all the API documentation for about any programming language or stack that you can think of. But if you go to like the little three dot thing up at the top there, actually just enable one of them if you haven't. And then yeah, go to offline data. You can actually sync that. If you click on the install on the right-hand side there, it'll download the doc set to your local machine. And then when you're
Cool.
offline, you up the API docs for HTML and CSS and stuff. I don't know what they use underneath. Now it makes me wonder, they've been around for a number of years. But
Let's check it out. Let's
yeah,
look at
it
the
kind of
network
makes me
tab
wonder.
here.
Yeah, let's
Yeah,
figure that
looks like
out.
we got a service worker here. No, where's my why I want to expand? Uh-oh, it was getting in the way. All right, there we go. Yeah, it looks like everything is cached via the service worker. We've got just one thing, but let's clear it out and reload. There we go. Yeah, it's all got something that's disk cache, but yeah, everything else is memory cache or service worker. Pretty
Yeah, so
cool.
this is kind of maybe like the perfect example, like what you were saying, of something that could be offline first, right? Like if
Hmm.
those doc sets change, but they don't change as frequently as, other things. And it's basically downloading a whole database for each of those that you want to look up. And when you search
Yeah,
it, just in terms of the interface, if you want to search for something that's like CSS, you can type CSS. And I think if you hit like tab, it will, if you do like CSS, I think tab, yeah, and then type, it'll context search within CSS.
cool. Yeah, this is
So
sweet.
pretty neat
Oh,
for, I
huh.
usually, when I'm pairing with somebody um, who's maybe more junior or new to a particular language or stack, I'll usually suggest that first so that they don't end up going and Googling everything and then ending up on a different API site every time. It's a little bit more consistent. So yeah.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, it's I highly recommend, like, if you have an application and you have something that is pretty much fixed, but you're loading into memory every single time a user opens the page, try out Dexy with IndexedDB or local storage, right? And give that a shot. Like you'll be surprised how much like faster especially if it's like a large amount of data, um, it'll be. And like another way you could do it, and I think like there is like the cache control headers as well, which are I think generally the way people do like caching and doing fast reads. But yeah, I think trying out some of these things to cache local stuff is It's a good idea for a lot of use cases. And you can
What is
sprinkle it in your app too.
what's the security story around this stuff? Like if you've got that data sitting locally, is there any, I mean, if somebody can open up the console, they can query that, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, for example, like go over here, like we can check if we go to the application, you can see exactly what's in your local storage. You can see exactly what's in your IndexedDB. So where's IndexedDB? There it is. It'll give you your database, and it's just gives you like a little thing exactly of what's in here, right? So there is like definitely security concerns. You obviously don't
Is
want to be
there,
dumping things like that, but there are people that are working on different solutions to that, like having different, first of all, like encrypting this data that goes into NextDB and having like an encryption layer between like your local
yeah,
rights and gets what's to get stored. But yeah.
that was kind of what I was wondering about, because like a lot of times security these days is kind of like the server sends down an opaque cookie that happens to know enough information that the server can like decrypt using the session. And it just made me wonder if there was anything built around that yet, or if it's like, do you just
Yeah.
use this mostly for like cacheable, assumed to be public information for that
Yeah,
particular
kind of.
user, or
Yeah, exactly. Like kind of a lot of this stuff is it's kind of like, hey, you have a laptop, right? You have a computer that you probably have a password on. That's your encryption for this
okay,
website, right?
gotcha,
Uh,
gotcha.
that's kind of assumed to be it. Like this is your data, right? Especially where cases like, hey, this is your data, like this belongs to you. So you can secure that data how you'd like whether you do whatever. And that's kind of applications where that's the truth are good candidates for like local first, but like you don't want to be sending like other people's medical records down to somebody's local computer, right? There's a lot of cases where local first is not the right not the right type of architecture for your application.
So how do they manage like I guess information is being cached in your browser and stuff? How would somebody like manage the amount of storage that it's using? Like if I were to install all of these JavaScript like from the DevDocs website, right? And I'm using too much memory and I kind of want to, remove some or whatnot. How
Yeah,
does like somebody who just doesn't know about programming or just isn't really very familiar with it, how do they manage that memory?
that definitely is there is more to think about. So that definitely is an issue, right? Like IndexedDB doesn't have memory limits. It's based on how much room your local computer has. So you can technically write almost infinite amounts of data to IndexedDB. You shouldn't do that, but you can.
One thing
And
that I've noticed about DevDocs is sometimes I come back after I know that I've installed the local version, the offline version, and it's not there. So I think it kind of treats it like iOS treats document storage, where like it can clean it up if it wants to. So it's not assumed, I think for me anyway, that the stuff, at least from DevDocs, is still there every time that I come back. So I don't know how much control you have over that as a developer, but it is interesting to see that sometimes it gets managed for you.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's why like a lot of times cache control headers are better because you can set how long that cache is going to be, sustained for. IndexedDB is like you've got to clear that out yourself, and then if their user's device runs out of space, you'll get an error while trying to write to it. So
Yeah.
you definitely don't want to be there basically ever. So if you are writing an application similar to like you would write like a mobile application, I think it's better to think about in local first apps like you would like an iOS app, right? Or like, hey, we have storage requirements. This is how much space we anticipate this app is going to be taking up. Make sure you have that amount of space, and then build that sort of application. Build your application within those bounds.
Mm. That's really cool.
Thank you. I think so too. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. I didn't expect it to go this long, but it did. So thanks to him for great questions, and Ruth and everyone else, Bill as well. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.